Hello everyone, today we talk about a very controversial topic, actually in line with most things that we normally discuss. I don't know how many followers I will alienate through it, but jokes aside, no, it's really something we're all well acquainted with, and that, however, I'm bringing to some other steps and or places, both in time and in historical terms, given the recent expansion of Schwerpunkt on more modern and contemporary warfare. This especially happened in the last year, and it's part of that final stepping up that I had planned for Schwerpunkt, at least in terms of sort of variety of topics and greater completion of historical and military historical view. For reasons that I can't digress on, I have drastically increased my productivity in the last year, so I have actually plenty of time. One of you asked me the other day, but Schwerpunkt, do you dedicate yourself solely to history, or do you have even other, time at least for the rest? Believe it or not, I do have time for the rest, and Schwerpunkt is actually just a consistent part of the world, but not actually close to the majority one, and I can't go even at some point with days without recording, but you will see videos being uploaded anyway, and that's the degree of sophistication that the channel's military industry has achieved by working at full regime over the years. A metaphor which partially fits today's topic, as a matter of fact, which is essentially an acknowledgement of the perplexity and the limits or the reevaluations of warfare, both in positive and negative terms, depending on whom we're discussing here, from a traditional perspective. Specifically, the idea that together with the degeneration of mankind, prophesied since ancient history and basically dictating all the major steps in fact, in the history of the universe, you could argue, with various ages, from the golden to the one of the wolf, so to say, which obviously cannot be left aside. Don't get me wrong, as you know, as a traditionalist, I firmly believe that whichever power derives from divine grace, there can't be essentially another source of power. And even though we pursue, of course, a general ideologism whenever we approach politics, the world, society, we end up sometimes essentially sacrificing or being blind to the objectivity that very often also, for example, propaganda, and the one that we know perfectly, to be perfectly aware most of the times, to be following. In many ways, because that's actually the purpose of it, not being simply blinded by it or something, unless in a willful and emotional, so irrational sense. Regarding the nature of powers that we feel to be rival to us, that are against us, essentially, most people start, at least this is my living life experience, not just on YouTube, obviously enough, as I was saying before, but out there, even at some important levels of academia. Just today I was watching a video interview of a colleague of mine that I detested, in part at least because of his. He was not such a repulsive person, but given his political siding, doctoral colleague back in the day. And I was just reflecting on this, like how complex it is to successfully criticize something that, even though it's so self-evidently wrong, still requires, especially for the others to understand the critique, to be properly analyzed, deconstructed, and in this sense, flattened eventually to its own degree of inconsistency, while recognizing positivity of some degree even. This is very complex because it involves not just a quite sort of sophisticated necessity of understanding human nature, but understanding at the same time that this standpoint from which we criticize is not the absolute one possibly attainable, right? I see this in interviews, in general attitudes, etc. Think about all those videos by Jubilee that apparently get a lot of views all the time. It seems to me that especially in the Anglo-American world, that has obviously become the most prominent in social media and basically dictates a bit the standards of same debates, of podcasts, etc. This is not much just the Anglo-American side of the aisle per se, right? But how eventually this has come to lead the world with some characteristics that are evidently shared by anyone, even regardless of cultural influences. Basically tends to give for granted, or at least many people give for granted, the fact that they are the only moral arbiters of the situation, and or that humanity somehow is, and pretending to dictate the rules of this, or not the laws of this, essentially just crossing out of the equation from any horizon the possibility, of course, that there is a foundational law. We would say of God, we would say the truth, that the more is exposed if anything, even just in a philosophical and methodological, moral, scientific fashion to debaters that seem to be mostly in the process of learning rather than having achieved some confidence in their own beliefs, cause some kind of hysteria and sort of incredibly violent rejection. And this is naturally a problem of the individuals as a litmus test of what objective standards actually carry out, we would say, but we're all humans, and so to a degree, we would say the truth does exist. That's the problem that they have mostly. Like, as in the doctrine of the two natures, there is a dimension where something is hyper real, really true, right? And another one that is by default rigged, and that is the human one, except the two natures are in contact with one another, are actually part of, are compenetrating, right, to a degree, or better. The higher nature is diluted towards nothingness in this spectrum, right, and we lay in between. So even why is this relevant? Because it seems to me that this kind of attitude, which is essentially empiricistic and relativistic, and if you say to a person morals are not relative, there is an absolute truth, etc. I have met, aside even from these kind of pseudo-intellectual contexts, people literally becoming phobic towards this. I'm talking normal, apparently superficially normal people that you could immediately guess having a terrible life and story and background and lack of education and parenting and more, and evident mental problems, right, in coping with life just by alienating from it and essentially taking the completely inverse posture needed to fix the issue, and so digging into the abyss ever more hopelessly, that even self-styled conservative standards start from this same standpoint, right? Just like what I was saying yesterday, for example, in that video about the history of mediavistics, looking at the legacies of the Enlightenment. Some were positive, admittedly, because the Enlightenment is also not a doctrine, an absolute body of dogmatic belief. Absolutely not. But it does correspond to the aforementioned steps toward in the degeneration of mankind, spreading this nonsensical idea, and also evidently contradicting one from a conservative standpoint, at least for the same definition of the term. Let's not even talk about tradition, regarding the positivity of the past, not much as some people, for example, on Reddit misportrayed me, if you remember back in the day, as if to say that I, for example, never thought in sort of by our own standpoint that life in, the Middle Ages for the average person was something you would like to experience given the advantages that you have gained now. The degeneration of mankind starts from essentially an individual standard, right? So this is not, as I was saying before, like today's power and capacities are the homogeneous mirroring of the generation, all right? This is not how it works. Always remember what kind of forces, for example, the Indo-European deities were conceived, in fact, in the same European mythologies, remembering them later, and how much they are needed also, as we very well know, as essentially subject in order to provide this force also to the leaders that provide with the form, right? So that's mostly what we mean, also because the Middle Ages, by the way, were a time in which, as we have explained already, the notion that you could save yourself, and so in a divine attainment was already lost. People have literally difficulties in understanding my point, or at least the point of tradition, that I'm just sort of a disclosure of a sort of vessel and that consists, as I was saying before, and this was just an example toward in the attitude towards enlightenment, that before enlightenment, essentially the world sucked, that people were stupid and bad, and then after enlightenment, science and technology and industry and whatever, and then we became capitalists, which is, as I always say, a Marxistic term designed with the ultimate purpose stealing your money, and in fact, not understanding that if you say I'm not a capitalist, if a person say, okay, so you're a communist or a social, apparently these people have an horizontal level of thought, and so an incredibly flat one. You're either from this side or the other. The vertical dimension of this completely escapes them, right? So if you say other things like, I don't know, I'm not a nationalist, right? They assume that you want to be flooded with immigrants or things like that, completely obliterating any, again, even remote doubt that it can be something that maybe is inherently superior and divine, and that is much more complex and in fact requiring a much greater effort to even sort of profile and conceive in broader philosophical terms. That's naturally a great problem of our era that has been widely amplified by the fact that even our better education compared at least to what the average person may have had before is not oriented or at least aligned with the traditional concept of the truth and all the obvious standards that technically we still uphold at this point, like concepts like merit, quality, value, they're all there, right? Where we can, again, deflect them, as we were saying before, we can look to the other way, but they remain, and that's why we frame them within a broader system, broader order, entailing an apical dominance of an absolute standard that is never alterable, and or at least that is capable of being fully attained, as differently from our dimension that has to recuperate that capacity and literally transcend its own status in order to achieve it back again. Because, again, we have the capacity to do so. It's not like we were passively. It's just like how people often interpret the Bible. There is this sort of omnipowerful God that basically decides everything. As far as the Old Testament, it's talking about the creation, the fall, and so these crucial moments that must be aligned also, for example, with the New Testament in a coherent way, and there absolutely are in the Holy Scriptures, but that can be easily flipped, even when you think you can buy that, right? The idea of Christ attaining victory as opposed to being vindicated by God, right? In this sense, in a passive fashion. Naturally, admittedly, most Christians would deny this just out of the fact that Christ is God, but there is a moment of attainment. There's a moment of improvement also in Christ's earthly life that therefore shows how this is something truly resting on mankind to attain, in fact, in the same imitation of Christ. We're not going to talk a lot about Christianity today. We're talking about war, and we're talking about topics attached to this bellicosity, including nationalism, imperialism, how, for example, the concept of crusade changed. That's why at the beginning I was saying this is very controversial, because whenever you talk about, I don't know, antiquity or the Middle Ages, people listen to you, they may even disagree with the fundamentals, but they sort of accept what you're talking about. But if you touch, on a more contemporary note, obviously everybody has something diversionary to say. They feel touched for some reason and do not even get the point that you're making. Admittedly, this does not happen often. My community is incredibly sort of patient, sort of tolerant, at least as far as evidently I don't exact much at all to begin with, and understanding. That's the reason why I came to this point. Naturally, it's a point that we will at some point rekindle with periodically, as far as, again, we will expand more in modern and contemporary warfare. But there is some foundational aspect of the saying that is worth appreciating and discussing. I say this because in that aforementioned set of sort of self-perceptional legitimization of the world's understanding and the definition at the same time, it's as if people wanted to believe also that standards are fixed, right? For example, I'm a Clausewitzian, as you well know, and von Clausewitz makes it really clear, even though he's not approaching any religious topic, for example, any cultural one. At most, he makes historical examples for the sake of the military theory and or the political connection with the military instrument, but he specifically remains out, but explaining to us essentially how not just the moral dimension is infinitely inflatable to a degree, and in fact, von Clausewitz takes very much on especially in the definitional aspects of warfare and the foundational laws of warfare, like some incredibly almost cosmic or mythological spectrum of understanding. He tells us, how do I teach this if not by showing you what happens at the minimum and at the maximum of this? This is a very traditional concept that was naturally partly expressed by philosophers very familiar to von Clausewitz, such as Kant and Hegel, something that definitely, as I often like to recall, Sun Tzu, living in the age of Pythagoras, was not quite sort of posed to counter, to even be compared with. It may seem, even for the hardcore Clausewitzians that want to stress that war is always the same, which is something which I believe, but in these foundational aspects, not in the declinations of it, in fact, fail to realize that there is a human standard that has a different grip throughout the ages, right? For example, many or most military historical studies today are informed by the notion that more or less humans were always the same throughout all of history, and that there weren't any particular psychophysical, at least especially physical differences from our own, so that biologically speaking, and also in a sense, in a biased way, in a psychological direction, you can sort of understand present and past warfare, first of all, without having ever fought in it, if we're sticking to the technical side of the story. Let's not even start to discuss the point of in war, like the hand of an army corps or the guy in the trenches, which is, as most people, for example, tend not to understand and to become very disappointed at, showing the disproportionately magnitudinal superiority of anything the former does, as opposed to the guy in the trenches that may not even understand anything about that war in any political, strategical, or historical sense, which is unfortunately often the case, and do not appreciate how, in fact, the study of military history is to be contextualized in a wider spectrum. Of course, when we study the Kriege, for example, we don't see much of this perspective because, at least in historical times, you can argue that, yes, human beings are similar, and that at the end of the day, also von Clausewitz's times were pretty rough ones. They were basically departing in that very moment from the more traditional background, and in general, you can absolutely understand why the Prussian general expounded warfare, looking mostly at its, again, inherent logic rather than any other, for example, anthropological consideration, of which he is a deep connoisseur, however. Thus, and this has been done a lot, for example, in cinema, especially in the last couple of decades. The last great age of movie making was in the early 2000s, and then everything ended, right? Also, as far as actual warfare and how warfare was depicted. Make a very simple check. Look at how, in Pearl Harbor, Saving Private Ryan, Black Hawk Down, fighters were depicted, and look at the incredibly whiny fashion in which basically any other movie that they made about Iraq or Afghanistan was depicted, right? Because even if, this is not to say that movies that accurately depict at any time how war is for real, but look at the narrative. Look at how just the attitude that we somehow inculcated in people, especially the younger ones, regarding what war is, right? And the negative feelings that surpass any kind of, awareness that always existed, that of course war is terrible to go through, and naturally it's very dangerous, even just for a state to embark himself in one, etc. But literally the attitude towards the hero, towards the archetype, toward the guy who eventually, back in the day, drove the thing more or less home. And also the guy who maybe lost, in fact, but still learned, hopefully, something from it, and could further inform civilization in a way that, in fact, is deeply loaded with some sort of pairing means as far as the possibility of war breaking out, and or like the necessity of having to fight it in the moment actually deals with, right? Why do I say this? Because essentially it doesn't seem to me that people understand war anymore. I've watched for years many veteran interviews, and it seems to me that even at a generational distance that you can immediately live through, there's been a radical collapse of human, especially psychological capacity, and also physical ones, obviously, because they're deeply intertwined. That's the correct metaphysical understanding of that. And that, aside from, the accompanying despicable rhetoric that I was talking about, has somehow reflected the broader collapse of civilization all across the world, right? So this video is not about saying, look at how, the Americans declined in power, now they became... This is not what the video is about. This is about realizing, to some extent, by which degree this happens, in part how and why, and realizing that we are all accomplice with this, to a degree, and that it's worth at least considering. These answers would be better answered had we already covered, which we unfortunately haven't, in spite of the great volume of videos on the history of warfare, what has been anthropologically called the ludic dimension of warfare. I do not fully agree with it, at least in the culturalistic anthropological sense that it often was sort of put on the fore. There is, first of all, war is a game, both objectively and subjectively, as von Clausewitz explains. It is for a number of reasons. There is also a specific taste for gamble in the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity, which is unsurprisingly connected with the military. It's unavoidable that the other two elements, that the government and the people, would reflect this ludic dimension to a degree, as much as, however, also war shows elements of the latter, from the government reason, from the people primordial hatred. So there isn't an actually dominant or defining aspect of war in a game per se, right? There is much more at stake that naturally makes this game a bit different from the type of games that we intend. At least the culturalist anthropological perspective tended, if anything, because it didn't really stem most of the times, actually any of the times, from a military historical, probably an art of war background, to almost sort of soften up the face of war, right? For example, all those cliches about the alleged bloodlessness of medieval battles stemmed from literally like something that happened also in other eras, the fact that prisoners were taken, especially among the nobility, but not preventing them from actually being massacred in large numbers on a normal basis, as we have seen many videos, battle videos, and we will keep discussing. Unfortunately, people go by anecdotes, and of course, if they don't have a systemic and, again, objective, accurate understanding of how things really work in war, even in those times, etc., they may start thinking, again, like culturalists do, that is, people that have literally never opened the von Krieg to begin with, also criticizing von Clausewitz, in fact, from this very odd and embarrassing standpoint, would not really appreciate the terrible nature of warfare that must be such for the same ultimate purpose that, in fact, war as a holy endeavor is understood like in tradition, right? The fact that there is a ludic dimension to warfare does not extirpate from that the most terrible, and literally terrible, meaning making you dirt, right? From terreo to become earth yourself, that was inherently at risk and so dying and being defeated in that sense, or the Apollonian dimension of control and the fact of taming of the lower, the most horrifying abysses of your own soul in order to divinely transcend through this chance, through this gamble that you, however, must get yourself into. If you're familiar with the Clausewitzian theory, you know how splendidly reflected by it this concept all is, except it's as if you, von Clausewitz was the explaining warfare in the European mythology, except without the more picturesque, the patina of general figurative an archetypal dimension beyond that, just explaining the military side alone, right? And still, however, rendering this parallel quite evident. This is an aspect we should actually recover from Clausewitz, and I personally never heard anyone making it anyhow. Like when you understand that the Indo-European tripartite order corresponds to the Clausewitzian wonderful trinity. And that, of course, the former has not to do with most people really think like that an allegedly categorical repartition of society according to, some post-traditional scholars that were obviously skipping the fact it was completely normal for those ancient traditions to have overlapping aspects in the cases as well. Otherwise, there would have not been a transcendental and transfiguring function of the same. Would really instead explain much more about our world than we are habituated to think. Naturally, warfare is per se, the historical warfare, but also the theoretical one, an incredibly controversial topic, at least in our world. It's also probably alarming how sort of, while central in political and social debate throughout all ages, warfare today is mostly reflecting as a the debates on warfare, this complete detachment from war per se. In the veritable understanding of what that war entails, at least say it's normal in warfare to have this kind of contrasts within the system, and actually the more advanced the system is, and the more such contrasts should occur, but with eventually a functional, positive, and resolutive settlement that will translate itself in the actual upper hand, or at least in a solid military performance. We will again explain better how these levels occur, but if you in fact think of how we mostly stop to, like, at least in most cases, war is bad, or at least we needed to simply to be safe, but not having a strategic culture or a political vision of power projection and world domination, one really wonders what this is all about, really. And this limits, unfortunately, are inherent the entirety of our system, including the military, including government, including the people. So this is a collective shortcoming of the system, where even those who understand war do not have the actual prestige to simply lead it, highlighting, according to traditional standards, the pretty sorrow condition, in fact, of a given community in this state. So it's possible, in fact, through these very indicators you can find in politics or in society, observe the degradation brought about by our modern, say the anti-traditional character of our civilization throughout history, through warfare itself, right? The strict military performance and the ideas mostly that revolve around the idea of warfare. So mostly even the positive ones, or the ones that should be positive, that instead are fundamentally separated from their specific field of application and context of, in nature, you could say, of war itself. This could be easily explained, as I have done for years, especially the earlier ones, through the obvious and easy, as accurate, however, accusation of average people not to understand war in a strategic sense, not knowing military history, not having really a strategic culture, or knowing the difference between these, for example, and the art of war, that are instead incredibly precise, and that pass through, as von Clausewitz teaches himself, a historical education, but also a specific method, and one that is, in fact, aiming at explaining in a satisfactory fashion what occurred in the past and what we can learn from the repetition, for example, of historical study. This would come about even just by repeating the military experience of command that is more important. I stress the one of command, not merely the one of, say, again, fighting per se, that surely has an educational aspect, but that is not, as we explained before, even properly, indicative of, for example, strategic understanding. While there are a few experts in the world about the art of war, we realize that while we may not be capable of leading an army because we lack that eventual connection to the practice of it, which is very technical, and that is what the military is trained for, the latter, the military themselves, are actually not often more competent than, for example, a few admittedly military historians, or those that actually study the art of war properly meant. And I'm not kidding about this. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? It's not like you enter this category immediately understand everything. Like, that's not what happens when you go to a military academy, all right? And even when you spend a lifetime in the military, even when you see action, or when you have at least been commanding an awful lot of men across pretty complex theaters, etc., you may get, of course, the gist of what this is all about. But if you haven't really developed, for example, a foundational education and theoretical understanding about warfare, for example, through the study of von Clausewitz, and mostly accompanied by the study of campaigns, battles, but through all available sources with the purpose of really sorting out what actually happened. It's incredibly difficult to have a clear, objective understanding of warfare. We can't, I don't want to make specific examples, but we had examples of military men that, said incredibly ridiculous things in the last years that turned out not to be true at all. And while some of it is political and some of it is just part of the sense, even if were it political, why would you say something wrong, right? Traditionally speaking, something false, it means that whatever can come to you is not a positive thing, right? The imperium flies away from you in the moment in which you shed even a single lie, right? So you can make this according, of course, to Iranian mythology back in the day, but for saying how seriously warfare and its understanding was, for example, taken in traditional societies, and not just because life was rougher at the time than today's. Or, of course, it's at least a phenomenal aspect of it, but it has a deeper logic behind it. Now, another problem that there are, because today it's really like a guideline of how to approach this, and especially the dual aspect of the same, is that many people at least believe, also because of some concepts that were spread in the last decades, that fundamentally there is a part of society that is the warriors, and that kind of go out there, fight, they're the beasts that you can unleash and it will get the thing done, and these guys come home and they're the heroes. So essentially having the mentality, or at least the understanding of the world of a person living in a tribe, while we're looking at global powers nowadays. So a completely alienated awareness of anything that constitutes not just warfare, but say politics and the history of the world and societies, etc. I haven't also, for this reason, really paid too much attention to the contrast, right? There are people who are evidently better fighters in ways that some people like to poetically call warriors, that, however, in those very tribal contexts were people that, yes, had a communitary purpose, but were also very much loaded with a sense of individualism, of pride, of sort of, they were fighting for the sake of themselves, and very often, in fact, accumulating power at the detriment also of the collectivity, in fashions that eventually brought the warrior to be crushed under the heel of civilization throughout history. Which, again, does not mean that today that warlike aspect is not there, it shouldn't be there, right? On the contrary, if you pick a military civilization like the Roman one, that in relative terms was definitely the most impressive in the history of mankind, you realize that while there was an incredibly brutal discipline, and that the Roman legionaries were extremely well trained and collectively, designed sort of troops to employ, the Romans believed, differently from at least some of the more theoretical of the Greeks, including Thucydides, that believed, for example, discipline could be alone satisfactory to make humans fight physically. The Romans said, no, there is a combination, there is an alchemy, right, between this preponderant disciplinary aspect that is very much deeply, developing from the elevation of the same successful warrior that is such because he knows how to fight not alone but with his followers, and is able to inspire them, to train them, to discipline them, to motivate them, and augmenting this whole race, this whole nation to heavenly achievements. That Rome is obviously the best example with that. But in fact, there is, in order to achieve that, a warlike dimension that can never and must never be eliminated, right? The Roman legionaries were, at heart, still brutal and primitive Italic warriors that like to cut heads, to fight individually whenever possible, and had even the space within these collective formations to unleash that bloody potential. We've seen this in many videos. We were talking about this also in the recent one of Pharsalus reading Caesar, which is an extraordinary source for Indo-European military theology, and we will make more videos about this topic. I illustrated part of this, tying it to the Clausewitzian theory, the same video about the Fortuna Caesaris, and so one of the most important theological topics in the history of mankind. Besides, we have seen it pretty much in every single video, which we could see how that element of violence, that educational dimension of violence, is always required. You cannot have a purely irrational system and thinking that is enough to win a war. At least that would be but an illusion, right? Thucydides was not wrong if you understand the dogmatic approach that the Greeks had to their Dorian Indo-European roots as the foundation of the world itself. Like if you were adopting Athena's reason, right, and transcending as a leader, and so the first element, the first person of the Clausewitzian Trinity as the government, that any other concern, right, of humanity, yes, in that sense, discipline alone could win. And Athena always defeats Ares, as we very well know. So that's the warrior right there, versus something that is not, because when we think about Athena, you may think about some rationalistic later Greek concept of the same, but it's absolutely not like that. Athena herself represents the soul of chivalry, represents the transfigured demon of victory that springs out of the same fact head of her father, the godfather, right? And so the guy who holds that imperium by the greatest extent. So there is a deep meaning to that. It's not merely, again, republicanistic or democratistic. It's actually heavily chivalric and knightly. As ancient people, such as the Romans, the same Greeks to a degree, we've seen it even in the videos about the political warfare. It may sound a paradox, but so it is. The Germans, the Celts, had attributed a knightly, a nobility, or in fact a divine dimension to the individual freeman, for at least to the degree he was also to the times he was an effective warrior in the process. Excuse me, I drink a little. What we see in the Middle Ages is most people collapsing in human standards, and so all the was at least needed in a moment to hold the system to the sustainable degree was not even as much as it had been in by classical standards. Was concentrated in the night, in a functionalization, paradoxically, is a form of modernization, secularization of a patch, a sort of provisional dimension. So when we will venture on the terrain of the passage from sort of feudal subjects to citizens in arms, we'll understand this better. I made multiple videos about, if anything, the Napoleonic era. From a conceptual point of view, the relation of that, especially Napoleonic ideology, with law and with tradition, that many people tend to idiosyncratically simply think, Napoleon was just the communist, the statalist, if not the communist, at least the statalistic imposer, the guy who wanted to deprive us of our freedom, especially, like, again, if you are from common law countries and you were fighting against him. And, I don't know, those are the terrible continental Europeans that just do bad things and not understanding, like, literal history. And not to say, again, that Napoleon's ideology, or especially where that was stemming from, was merely, was positive, but was an achievement. Again, it was the consequence of a general collapse of also a great part of the Ancien regime. But there are eagles at the head of Napoleonic armies, and you should try to understand that also the civic tradition of the past was very much modeled after the classical one, which can't be also taken as an accident. And of course, the Jacobins would see the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans in ways that were not very much in line with that, as we've seen, de facto crypto knightly mentality that those peoples back in the day believed. Because again, 18th, 19th century France is not that, as just like the rest of the world at the time. It was not what was 2,000 years before. But again, you must see this in perspective, otherwise it would just stop to pretty useless arguments that cannot be spent really in this broader criticism. So there is a human dimension of the warrior, if anything, that gets crushed, and an ideal divine of the warrior who battles for his prince's honor and rights. That is, for example, already telling of certain distinctions that we should make. Because, again, the warrior that most people think of living today, just an uneducated, tattooed imbecile who thinks that he can't, go out there just claiming to have fought somewhere and to have been exploited by his own government, but acting like a fucking 12 years old because of, in fact, previous issues that have nothing to do with his military service, is not exactly what we understand as a warrior, all right? And there are excellent soldiers, there are excellent people in the military, but any category is provided with these individuals, right? This is why I always talk badly about historians like myself. That's not, and I've seen too many interviews to veterans that basically showed, in some cases, some feministic, communistic, superstitious, anti-state, in that case mostly was anti-American stances by people that were, in that sense, had become more vulnerable rather than having stepped up through the experience of war. And pursuing this kind of self-sabotage, blaming mechanism that really will never help anything in anyone, and that indeed do not seem to have understood much about war, not to have even began to again, this is not a problem of the military service. This is a problem which background you come from. All right, if you are a completely fucked up person with, again, no background whatsoever, that at 17 is already a chronic alcoholic, that has mental issues because your parents, if we can call them like this, I don't know, have 3 other families who cheat constantly one another, are toxic people, and you can't keep anything together. Obviously, it's not by being shipped to fight a war overseas that much is going to change. I mean, in theory, war could be the catalyst to that issue. But most of the times, on this already mentally fragile people, such experiences that are obviously brutal and traumatic do not really help. Nobody teaches. This much is true, that not there being an actual strategic education in the world, and not being there an actual acknowledgement of human limits to begin with, there is no such thing like any possibility also to receive a better treatment in exchange. For example, I always complain about people, right, of any kind, right? But I do not have a distrust towards authority. I do not have a distrust toward institutions. And not get me wrong, I actually do know what that authority, as we intended, at least as in, I have faith towards this thing as far as the institution as a whole is concerned. All right, per se, because I believe in the doctrine of the two natures. I believe in the civilizational values of these institutions. Obviously, I'm not going to have any trust in the individuals, right? I come from a family of doctors, and it's not like I've seen, my parents doing something bad at any time, but they told me so many stories about hospitals and how things get down to, and you can easily see even when somebody gets old and how they're treated while they're dying, or when they have particular illnesses. I mean, the world is seriously messed up, all right? There is no absolute way to deny that. So surely the experience in the military, I can imagine being very disheartening at some level if you meet especially with the wrong people, with the wrong sort of mob-like mentality or whatever. Conversely, the systems still work. They still uphold some sort of standards of some kind. And again, we can measure even their effect on the base of this. And in that sense, that's what we have. This is our human, mortal, fallen condition. We can't be surprised that things get down to that. For example, the idea of the warrior, for example, was a warrior. And what's the ultimate purpose of the warrior? Because holy war in tradition has the ultimate purpose of the leader, and so the victorious military leader, to in fact conduce the world to a transfiguration. And this can take on many forms, right? There is not just warfare per se, because violence may be some matter of semantics, right? When the leftists say everything is violence, we laugh at them because conventionally it's ridiculous. But if you really think about it, the problem with the leftists in that statement is not that violence can be really present in everything, but the fact that they think it's a negative thing. We as traditionalists think that it's actually a positive thing, right? And actually that every kind of suffering and pain and shortcoming derives from your own sins, does not derive from any perpetrator. Or it does, but it's at the same time inextricably intertwined with what you did. And so what you did forever in the world, a bit like an eternal return of equals, like in the Nietzschean partial, again, understanding of tradition itself, right? So if you're a warrior, but you are, for example, a subordinated, in that sense, who's the alpha male? to be quite brutally straightforward, okay, you can imagine, I don't know, that every warrior is an alpha male of some sort, but not quite, or not necessarily, at least I'm not making the point here that is not the case, or that it shouldn't be. I don't even know why I thought this right now, but the question is to make you understand that there is always somebody above you that has some more massive attributes than you, and you could and you are in this hierarchy to learn how to be better, because there is an ultimate purpose, not an abstract qualification of warrior that should sort of set you apart from what, from whom. Right? There are many ways to achieve transfiguration. This is not just a war. War, for different reasons that we explained very much for years, is definitely the human endeavor that, in interest of consequences and control, is in fact the most directly responsible mechanism for world change. Right? There are the greatest forces contained in your hands, in your very hands, meaning that warfare is not fought by itself. You must want it, you must drag it on. For how terrible this is, which also defies the idiotic, culturalistic, and also, again, naturalistic reason that warfare is merely just a lower instinct, right? Because the lower instinct of humanity is actually survival. So it's a bit difficult to attribute some kind of barbarism or, let's say, of inferiority to war per se. There is a lower level, which is exemplified by, for example, the Christian, not paradox, but example. That is to say, you can attain an enormous amount of power without reducing yourself to, I don't know, have material tools to kill someone by destroying his body in a fallen earthly dimension. This obviously takes on a very metaphysical character and does not, however, either eliminate the importance of warfare as a mean to potentially transfigure, which is actually attainable, in fact, through any kind of action, right? Not just warfare. Warfare, however, has a preferential path, like its implications, and so not its abstract conception. The way it's wielded actively requires your full commitment to an ideal, to wanting, again, to risk your life, to sacrifice your life in order to achieve a particular goal of the kind that we describe. So the the point of this, again, is quite crucial because, unfortunately, I know this is especially a thing in the United States that I love in many ways, but that unfortunately came up at some point with this stuff that was spread at a lower level and the masses kept talking about it. The concept of warrior is not antithetic, but it's surpassed, at least in the more instinctively low dimension that most people understand it. Again, just the tribal warrior that, as Indiana Jones, that I never also really liked because I couldn't ever really medicinate it. I always found it, in fact, too much of low masculinity, but exemplifies, can be wiped out in a second without too much of a problem. Warfare teaches you to widen horizons, and in fact, it's not just that chthonic, telluric, titanic, and in fact, anti-ideal, anti-Apollonian figure of the pre-Indo-European warrior that tells it all, right? In the Indo-European mythology, the Indo-European heroes are actually smaller, mostly than the Titans. Of course, there are some lower creatures that are equally sort of subordinated to the bigger guy, the nobleman of the Aesir, etc. But the greatest, the biggest, at least, fighters, the biggest warriors, so to say, are the ones that are eventually slain by the guy who has providence, who has wisdom, who has this divine capacity that goes beyond that merely low human and popular and vulgar model. In a sense, the follower of the retinue is already inferior to the medium of the divinity that essentially is commanding that very soul. Think about that, because in a position of command, this is exactly what happens. That you can have a competition between warriors themselves, but there's always hierarchy in warfare, right? It's the best ordained and most efficient community that you find out there. Not much because, again, the individuals are uniquely superior, still from stats of pretty much everywhere. The United States, for example, has made studies on this, like the soldier has, on average, a higher IQ. Yeah, okay, but within which range still? Of the average IQ, which is often not, like if the general populations can't be particularly flattering in general, right? So the higher you go, the more control you can have, because this is not merely an intellectual aspect. Von Clausewitz discusses this. It's not just by being intelligent or rational that you will have the qualities to command men and leading them to victory. This is not how it works, right? But it's as if these standards over time degraded in the history of mankind, descending to the mere, however you want to call it, the soldier. The soldier per se does not have a negative implication as a concept, but we can use this word, at least for today, to indicate as opposite to the holy warrior, rather than the warrior just, again, in that lower also. There are, again, warriors also in underdeveloped societies, for example, that according to tradition are not the primigenial ones. They're the ones who fell the earliest because of the lower quality, right? So if you look at some, Stone Age, quote-unquote warriors, not really your ancestor that in theory is meant as, in much more recent times to have arrived descended from heaven, and still because of a sin, by the way. In any case, this guy, the main difference is the fact that this warrior, this soldier, as opposed to the holy warrior, is devoid of any transcendent or religious essence in the act of fighting. This is crucial, really. Combat for the path of God, for example, today is understood as some kind of medieval fanaticism, right? Whereas fighting for example, patriotic and national ideals or other ideas, so to say, has been deemed acceptable to a degree, without focusing on how, for example, the path to God may be superior to merely a patriotic or national ideal. As I explained at the beginning of the video, for all those people who think, but there is nothing wrong to fight for your fatherland or for your nation. Yes, but we should understand where that is leading to. That's a point we made also yesterday while talking about how in the passage from the Enlightenment to Romanticism, for example, that this is very fitting. From one side was a desacralization of warfare in general because of the general temper of the Enlightenment. However, some kind of reaction brought to the idea of nation as central to any kind of broader attainment. Now, it's not like in tradition the nation is not important, or it shouldn't be, in fact, the unavoidable starting point from which you personally take off. Naturally, can be nation, can be clans. That's, as I was saying before, like how many tribes existed within the nation, or so why not the tribe, according to nationalists, right? So this is the point. Nobody here says, I mean, today we understand nationalism in ways that we wouldn't substitute with the tribalism that, for example, has taken on a negative concept. And in fact, the path of God doesn't even assume that kind of tribalistic dimension, as we just explained, because there is an elevation to that. So you understand that there are different standards that are completely unhinged from any traditional hierarchy. Naturally, the land of your fathers, assuming that it's land, because that's what it's meant. It's not even the patris, it's literally the patria, right, the fatherland. And as such, you can understand that, yes, you can fight for that, as long as you don't fight for the piece of dirt itself, but of course for the people who live there, so that there is a higher sense of also literally of ranking of beings in the world, considering that also the dirt is a product of our own sin. As we cracked the celestial vault during the fall and sort of incarnated and created this valley of sorrow. The same goes for natio, because again, the nation is the place where more or less you have been born, right? You know that these terms come from Latin, and the land of the fathers was ancestrally. This is also connected to the Indo-European concept. It was a land of the fathers. That was not necessarily the place where you were born, because that's nation naturally comes from natality, right? And you have to put there some kind of limit. Like what is even more important, the fatherland or the nation, right? Think about immigrants, people of different ancestry, even in countries that, of course, rocked pretty much from a national point of view, like the United States. This was a problem also during the world wars, right? There were, I don't know, many German Americans who definitely had Nazi sympathies, even when being drafted to fight in Europe against the Germans. There were all kind of intricate, there always are, all kind of intricated relations that surpass, in a sense, the fatherland and the nation, and put to the test individuals to a degree that also, as you understand, even just this example sort of diluted such beliefs in a higher way, right? If you don't put God at the highest level, like you can't put your nation. There is actually a more sophisticated way to tradition that could make you think that since you are the fallen kind, the point of wanting to transfigure as much as possible, in theory, mankind, that was the standard of God through Catholic universal standards. It would still, however, also in that case, pass through a national leadership. Like there must be a leader, must be a hierarchy, ranks. And so if a people is the master race, they can take over the world. And just like, I don't know, the Macedons, the Romans, the Franks, etc., and basically having the others being augmented, being also partly transfigured in the process. This is exactly what the Holy Ghost, the Imperium, actually does. But again, what kind of, even there, like even when you choose the nation, why the nation? Why not you personally? Or why not the entire world? Or why not, I don't know, your nation plus another guy that's passing by across the border? Like it can be that random, and there is no law, no rule that basically says that while these groups and this affinity naturally between connationals is higher and is definitely functional, that you can attain the ultimate goal if you don't even focus what the ultimate goal is, that is divinity. So this is a great problem, right? Because there were, for example, nationalists and atheists at the same time, right? There was, for example, a few people know this, but in the early fascist movements in Europe, there were lots of Jews that, however, were in turn atheists. Now, any other considerations? These were very, pluridecorated veterans of World War I. Eventually, were brutally put down by the racial persecutions of Nazi fascism. But just for telling you how shaded this can be, right? And these aspects are somehow notorious, and this can really also occur in the lifetime of a person changing ideas at different times. So we can say that these other sort of lower instantiations of an allegedly of a supreme idea, in a broader Catholic sense, have shed their disguises, exposing themselves as instruments of a fallen kind that has not even started to think whether the things they're fighting for are the ultimate and the most important. Again, not saying that you simply say, okay, so we fight for God and it's fine. No. Fighting for God, of course, means also by the initiation rite of the ancient culture, etc., something much deeper, much more sort of esoteric and really also metaphorical to a degree, that was enhanced through warfare, through physical activities, and to a special, properly predisposition towards the cosmos and beyond. However, it's obvious that there are excuses by which people are convinced to fight wars. And these excuses are not even that bad they are bad in as much they are excuses, so they are, by definition, they're not really telling the truth. But they're also handled by people who are capable of guiding these people. As we explained in the video, for example, about how World War I happened, right? The notion that peoples are basically poor victims drafted by the terrible state, and the decisive majority of the people does not dictate the fact that the people goes at war itself, is the fruit of mental illness, right? People's fought wars because the people want to go to war, and even if this is somehow enforced, if the people as a whole had the moral capacity to prevent their government to go at war, which happened in many circumstances, it would stop. All right, this is also obvious if you have any historical understanding of the debates pre and post wars, and how eventually wars are fought or they are not fought, or especially they are won or lost along that pattern. So if you miss that level, if you think you're a victim of your government, you're just automatically crossed out of Indo-European tradition, of any trace of traditional identity, and you do not belong, right? You're already gone. You cannot attain the higher perennial nature at all. You're already done. And in fact, sort of bends to different ideologies, and they can come disguised again at different things at the same time. Materialism, even rationalism, not reason but rationalism. Remember, not nation but nationalism. Understand the difference. It's just like the fascists, right? Fascism is something. The ancient notion of the Lictorian acts is actually one of the most straightforwardly civic political. It's in fact, it's the fascists are depicted all over half the world. In the world's institutions, including the Senate of the United States, and they are obviously one of the most straightforwardly, in fact, showing the how united a people is to be strong and to be victorious, or even not needing to fight a war because the enemy knows that with that kind of cohesion, he would be destroyed by, right? There is also another aspect of warfare that is mostly measurable in the outcome of the same. meaning that all these ideology eventually can be tested in what they produced. For example, tradition says that you have to salvage life as much as possible, meaning that there could even be, and this was expressed by some at different mythological, religious, doctrinal levels in tradition, into traditional antiquity and beyond, that in order to transcend and to therefore save lives and making them pass to the heavenly dimension, you actually have to kill. Right? There is you could say, biological economy, whereby by killing one bad guy, say, you can save another life. Naturally, there is a broader picture where the question is, if that guy was to be killed in the first place to prevent another person to die or not to be born, whatever, what kind of control did you have on the premises of this? Meaning, couldn't you properly create something, that a world where this did not happen? Whose fault is that? It's everybody's fault, right? So that it's always a very risky and liminal aspect, as much as difficult as properly presuming what tradition actually says, that you can essentially surpass the principle of the second principle of thermodynamics. You can't create other energy without losing more, right? That's the actual game. And we could at some point digress on physics and how tradition can overlap with that. But the ultimate point is that if by a war you destroyed more than creating, not even destroyed more than gaining, because that's literally the same thing. There is no difference between you gaining and you creating something new, right? In addition, you have failed in a broader sense, right? And that's actually the only ground on which you can look at the history of mankind and objectively realize that warfare is something incredibly perplexing. At least it's something that, to an extent, we understand at some point it needed to be done. But if anything, was, even in its inception, already the price to pay for some wrongdoing that had happened before, and the accumulation of our sins throughout the generations, rather than in the moment, okay, it was good to fight that war. Meaning, if you were the shiniest, perfect leader, and why wouldn't you convince the world of the worthiness of your reason? Why wouldn't the truth align with that? So you can argue that you can criticize, at least at every level, any war, as long as this does not seem to have brought actually an improvement in mankind or not. Sometimes, however, there does seem to be a broader positive mathematical outcome out of that. I mean, I don't think that, it's difficult to express. You can't easily say it for any war, all right? And this is important as far as we have developed a convention regarding our understanding, for example, of how a war was good and well celebrated and another was kind of meh. In part, this, or at least this is a perception. And it is true that people are somehow deceived by this or that narrative, and that people do not know even about certain things that happened in the past. They convince themselves to be part of the narrative that is not there. And definitely not, I'm a military historian, so I study a lot of wars, and I will not explain in this video where my perspective stands in front of all the wars that I studied that ultimately formed this broader pattern, this broader tapestry that tells me that, of course, everything is intertwined, and so every war seems more familiarly obvious to me than probably most would believe. To people, wars are these big things they sort of remember back in the chronological timeline of their memory of their school or whatever, and they say, oh, that war and that other war. Of course, I come from a slightly different background, and to me that's something much more fluid and part mostly also of a broader political and historical and cultural trail that in that sense does make sense and does not impress me more than much. I'm much more sensitive to some broader ideal issues than warfare. right? I got heavily desensitized also to violence, to gore, to any kind of sort of physical brutality that you can imagine. Because at the end of the day, it makes sense. It's always the same. There's nothing special about it. I mean, it's a big deal, but it's not something that impresses me more. There are many people just don't want to hear about war because they can't really watch pictures of blood or whatever. I've never been like that to begin with, but obviously there is a problem also with this kind of mentally fragile people. As we've seen, there are different kinds. So today doesn't have to be the day in which I shoot on the Red Cross regarding all the possible ideologies that may have failed people, because otherwise I would place myself exactly where I don't want to be, because I believe that any ideology has some reason to exist in the bigger picture, right? For example, just from a, beyond far right-wing traditional perspective, to me, like just by theological coherence, the fact that there is a left that is mischievous and bad and despicable and makes you, ashamed for themselves, etc. It's not a problem, because the point is that as long as they do something bad, they're going to fail at that. And there have been specific, for example, the current situation in the United States, it may not be optimal in general, but derives from the obvious failure of the left in its extremism, and it doesn't seem to, for example, to be ending. It's not like, the Democrats have learned that they have blipped up at every level. They're going to double down on that, right? And it's not even, again, a matter of elites or so. It's literally what that culture has become, and unfortunately, if half of your country is in a way, say between two sides, of course, one is better, one is worse, but the general social-cultural fabric of is identical. All right, so unfortunately, I was glad mostly about Trump's rise, because I knew that he would change most of those things and postures. I was sure that, of course, he would support Ukraine, as it obviously happened. But you see, there are people, first of all, who fear the unknown because they literally don't have the long-sightedness of saying, there's a bigger picture in the world, politically, strategically, culturally, that if it changes, because everything changes and can't even properly be seen, will not change to some degree, at least in the near future, so to say. Most people are completely vulnerable to that. They literally have no idea. They leave suspense in a vacuum, and they don't seem to have any certainty or solidity. I think that what makes really a solid leader at the end of the day is exactly being able to soar in this ether of unpredictability and handle the situation, trying to fix it at the end of the day, to try to make an order out of chaos. And this is obviously what warfare is at the end of the day. This is the actual meaning of it all, that of leadership in everything. Of course, you can express it in much higher ways, but as far as conventional, concepts are concerned, this is exactly what it gets down to. So going back again to a series of ideas that we do not criticize themselves per se, but rather in the way people misunderstand them, it has slowly become evident that where, for example, the homeland was romantically evoked, schemes of annexation, domination, or the interest of, narrow parts of the community often lurked. Again, there is per se nothing wrong in expanding your own power. Who goes under, in a sense, as we've seen in a broader metaphysical logic, sort of deserved that, which is it's terrible to say. I'm not saying that this is something easy to accept and most people are prepared to accept. I'm not even saying this is conventional. I think it's completely normal to feel for, who goes down. The question is, first of all, there is a difference also between people who are conventionally understood as innocent or not innocent in the way they go down. There's no doubt about this. But in a broader picture, again, who were these peoples? Why did they coalesce in the way they did? Why did they go at war, and was that outcome? This is valid for everyone. I'm not referring to anyone in particular. This is valid for literally every person. It can be literally even the guy in the victorious side that got killed, first in the war. All right. This always reflects some broader order. The grand speeches about heroism as well are often misused in that fashion. The hero in the past was literally what we described before. Mithras that from a stone becomes the sun himself and saves the world in the process. So a hero, of course, there are people who... I also used the term. When I was younger, I used... a younger military historian in particular, I used it in a much less... I didn't use it at all, telling you the truth. It's even in the early videos of Schwerpunkt, to some extent, I said, I don't like to use the term hero, I tried to dodge it. Then eventually, by getting more into the anthropology of warfare and observing the broader meaning behind such notions, the question highlighted itself in as much as a warrior successfully self-sacrificing in holy combat, so attaining a result, is a hero. And so even a person who, is able to take down lots of enemies, finally succumbing, but allowing so many others to succeed, to live, and being critical of many things, is conventionally understood as a hero, right? There are some military historical events that cannot be described in a different way. Naturally, at this point, it's also a way to deplete the original meaning of the hero. But in fact, here we're talking about heroism. So everything ending in ism is fundamentally an excess of some sort, an extremization of the same. While we're seeking objectivity, right? And so the speeches about heroism were mostly delivered by those who waved off others at train stations, sending them to face war as an entirely different reality. A crisis that rarely resulted in genuine heroic transformation, but instead led to a regression into savage instincts, because we're not sympathizing for the guys who were shipped to the front, all right? And all of a sudden discovered that war was bad, right? There's this thing that is being spread, again, together with the myth of the butchers and movies and so on, that, again, that the poor guy that, these were just kids who were just indoctrinated. We thought everything was heroic, and they arrived to the front, and they saw how war really was. I don't know, these were people who lived in times where, their fathers and grandfathers they had gone to war. They knew what that was. It's not like they lived in an aseptic dimension where they had never heard of war, and they had never especially lived in incredibly difficult times. These were people that, had seen their younger siblings dying of, the most stupid illnesses back in the day. They were poor as blip. They were habituated to work as children. They lived incredibly brutal lives. So actually, the idea of going out there and taking out the enemies of your country, because of course your country wanted to expand, and it was an obvious gain from that, and also for your own people, it's completely normal. The problem we're highlighting here is heroism, the fact that these people, say in the age of mass society, were sent to war, making them believe that it was easy to become a hero, a real hero, a hero of tradition, right? Because again, we're so assuefacted to the notion that, again, our understanding of hero was the one of tradition, that for us, again, if we think about 1914 and say, there was kind of a heroism in what these people did. Some people did heroic things, again, there's no doubt. But in general, the propaganda about heroism was of a much deteriorated kind, as much as the masses were of a much deteriorated kind. These were mass society for testators. What did they have to do with knights, with the elite? All right, with even a kind of life that, as we've seen, was very brutal, but was definitely softer compared to the one of people living, 3,000 years before. And so while it was completely normal to, get married and having children at 18, saying, hi, there I go to war, killing people, and then if you came back, instead of exploding, or being machine gunned, came back and say, I killed 10 people, now let's go on, with our family, kind of sit comedy sketch with fake laughs in the background style. Obviously, this reality was not much of a heroic one. It was a pretty miserable one, and a pretty low kind of a pretty vulgar one that had barely to do with real heroism. And naturally, again, some stories are of true heroism, but we also know lots of stories that are much less edifying, and not just out of anti-war propaganda. On the contrary, in fact, as we will see now, there was a sense of feeling orphaned of the actually best and good ideals, exactly because you fought, as we said before, in an imperfect system of fallen kind that didn't even know how, of course, to handle themselves in a dignified way during such wars in many ways, and in their just giving free rein to their animal kind of lowest instincts and not the higher transfigured divine ones, and hopefully anything above the former for that matter. Right? This is kind of obvious. Who's the average person in mass society? An animal. Is there anything, do you think that there is anything literally more to that? Which is also the reason, by the way, why people were sent to the front in the droves, in the millions, to get butchered that way, because that's more or less what happens, what we do with animals in our ways. And again, why does that happen? Well, because traditionally, why is the proof that what I just stated regarding the quality of humanity in that way. Naturally, there are some literary references that are famous and others we can pick on. For example, the so-called war novels by Remarque, particularly In Westen nichts Neues and Der Weg zurück, offering insight into the stark contrast between patriotic rhetoric and the grim realities of war for certain Central European generations in particular. We explained many times what Mitteleuropa actually is, and why literature, especially coming from, again, the interwar period, at least this first half of the 20th century, is so relevant in historical hindsight. I often explain how these countries were still literally living in the Middle Ages until World War I. Naturally, yes, things had changed, but the fundamentals were the same. This is not true for the West, right? Even though there is a form of tradition that, as we will see now, actually existed, unsurprisingly, in some of the most advanced countries, such as Britain, for example. Britain, during World War I, resumes an incredibly important level of, for example, traditional iconography, knights, angels. There's a very nobiliar attitude. Some poets that, I don't know if it's assumed all of these, but that tended to just blame war, whereas you had figures like Tolkien, for example, that I don't particularly celebrate, at least for the most conventional reasons, because in my opinion, he did not understand, even as a Catholic, the meaning of providence and of power. But among the positive things, it was not the only one here, just a name for all, actually witnessed both the horrors of the trenches during the Great War, but also the actual meaning and purpose behind that, which is nothing short of a miracle in a world like that, and really expresses some deeply traditional veins still living in countries of, for example, very old industrialization, like the same Britain. that you would expect being sort of the more degenerated. If you follow, again, the notion that more power is more degeneration, that's not quite the case. That's not how it works, right? It may be more often than not happening toward that direction, but it's not because the others are better, first of all, and nor because there is not a way to actually make things go the right way. And usually the more powerful, the greater civilization, which turns out, in fact, to be in history also the more powerful one, is also the one that has the means to withstand this kind of impulse, this kind of background, right? But at least Remarque, for example, complained about this contrast. And it's not like it did not exist. It is true. I also made a video about the adaptation in 10, 20, I reasoned like in 13th century years, in 2022, if I'm not wrong, the adaptation of his most famous novel in a series. I think it was on Netflix, and it was a movie actually. That I didn't find very interesting, to tell you the truth, but very insisted at least on that kind of narrative that many kids also online today always repeat like parrots without actually having any kind of broader understanding under their point of view, to say, oh, look, these kids were basically lied to, they were sent to be massacred. Again, it's not like a kid in 1916 Germany was not aware what was actually happening. Yes, they were being sort of lied to regarding the state of, for example, the enemy as opposed to their own. We talked about this. We have seen it in the series about the Kaiserschlacht, as a matter of fact. That deeply impacted the Germans when they stormed the first British trenches and they realized that they were stuffed with food, as opposed to theirs that, where they were really hungry and from a long time. Like that hit hard, more than the British and the French bullets. So, in a sense, there is a mischief and a lie, and again, that is not good. That's not a good indicator of a healthy civilization. But at the same time, it's a bit of a mistake to presume that also a reaction from World War I, and of course consider that here we're looking at a Central Powers perspective, so the one of the losers at the end of the day, which is also, frankly, like as always in war, like the perspective of the defeated is generally more interesting, that at least for the historical sake and political meaning and more, than the one of the winner. But it's not justifiable in some sort of simple distancing from war, or just presenting it as a mere scam or something that doesn't make sense. And it's not. I mean, Remarque's books are deep, insightful, and they're they illustrate what was happening in many ways. And of course, it was criticized at the time, being described as anti-patriotic, and having, in fact, some influence also beyond his own national background, saying this is kind of defeatism that spreads, in fact, as a cultural idea, regardless of nation, flag. Now, similar experiences likely occurred among other nations, by the way. There was Barbus, an Italian officer, for example, who wrote, quote, "From a distance, war may seem to carry a hue of chivalric idealism for eager spirits and a sort of choreographed allure for estates. Future generations must learn from us that nothing is more, this where again the veterans of World War I, is nothing more deceptive than that charm, and no myth is as absurd as the one ascribing any virtue, progress, or education to war beyond cruelty, upheaval, and numbing brutality. Stripped of its enchanting veneer, Bellona is more loathsome than Alcina, and the young men who perished in her embrace recoiled in horror at her touch. Yet we had no choice but to take up arms." Right? This is also relatively whiny, right? It's not, again, we don't speak for the horrifying experiences of these men that really witness something that is indescribable until you get into it. And we must take, in this sense, what they say for for good. I mean, in understanding that obviously the picture is the one illustrated, but it's just one part of a broader canvas, right? The most famous author tied to the Great War, who eventually expressed some actual traditional confidence, and again, we cited Tolkien, etc. There is, again, that sense of chivalry and nobility, the fact that, if anything, there was a right reason to fight that war. This is also, one of the most important, naturally, aspects of any kind of assessment of any war. Like, why was it war? Especially, it's a political question, because one must decide, as we've seen it. So it's the product of a collective responsibility and beyond. But notoriously, the peak of, let's say, the realization that warfare can be a gateway to a transfiguring experience is expressed by Ernst Junger, especially early works informed by his personal combat experience, where the notion resurfaced that these processes can shift in nature, that the most ruinous elements of modern mechanized warfare can shape a superior type of individual, transcending both patriotic idealism and humanitarian or defeatist sentiments. A couple of years ago, there was a Ukrainian follower that began to follow me exactly in 2022, in fact, and he got wounded. I don't know anything about him anymore, but they put him behind a desk at a point, and he would have wanted to come back to the front. I hope he's alive. But, I mean, this guy was literally sent to the front, and it was cheering. Like, I didn't really interact with him more much. He commented on Schwerpunkt, and eventually I haven't heard of him anymore. And again, I really hope he's okay. But this guy had been sent to the trenches, and he came back writing, telling me that he had been wounded by shrapnel, and he had been hospitalized and everything. He had been removed from the combat areas, of course, for a while, and it was my understanding that he had to come back at some point. And he said something incredible, something that, say, most people wouldn't simply say from a person who literally went through that, to say that war was literally the most uplifting experience in his entire life, that this is really the key to become someone and more than you can imagine. And this is actually perfectly aligned to a traditional concept. And it is, we could access this from different levels. One starts from camaraderie, for example. And so that sense of divine bond that would have existed between, the ancient war bands following their seniors, a minimum of divinity that now possessed them as if they belonged to an entire body, and they didn't fear to die anymore as single individuals. These are real things. Right, we know pretty darn well how they work. Like the concept of brothers in arms, it's something that has been somehow mostly anthropologized and sociologicized. I don't know how to say that, or psychologicized, etc. But people forget that the entire traditional body of knowledge about warfare and the same military historical sources tell us continuously about this. That it was the sort of the most straightforwardly obvious thing that was known about warfare. And now we just, we studied such a fascinating phenomenon. Look at how strange it is. But do you realize that you live in a culture that up to a few generations ago knew perfectly what that was, and that for reasons that now we can't digress on, this stuff has been eliminated from the picture, has been deleted, canceled, or at least say brought to this lower kind of explanation in this incredibly this humiliated fashion, this emptied fashion, right? Now, Ernst Junger's work is really famous, right? And the notion is that basically, if you make it alive from this terrible, like steamrolling up butchery, but not only, like especially the comparison of your at least apparent especially bodily frailty, in front of the harshness of iron that represents also the fourth last age, you realize that moral forces, the spirit, the soul, is what is actually the strongest mover behind the soul. As we explained, warfare does not happen because at some point shrapnel starts flying in all directions for no reason. There is somebody who's fighting from the other side. And so the only way to respond is to go out there and risk and actually die at some point, but still knowing that the only way to go through that is surpassing your own fears, to accept this. There's a beautiful passage from the Von Krieg that illustrates how this happens psychologically, and he even explains that even though you will very quickly adapt to literally seeing people shot next to you on a regular basis and bullets flying and all this stuff continuously, you will enter in by entering literally a mode, right, that is evidently there already say part of our genetic background and functionality. This will still take a toll, right? So the fact that you can't take it doesn't mean that you can't go on forever with that, if anything, because you're human mortal, right? But Jung nails the fact that it's this contrast between the frailty of life and the magnitude of power that shows you how beyond human power can actually go when you realize it is the fruit of a hierarchical mechanism and not some kind of clash of matter thrown into the cosmos like billiard balls for no reason. So there is some in Jung, there is a very interesting approach that, as we explained, transcends the patriotic idealism itself. Right? He understands that it's not because simply of that flag or piece of dirt that you're actually fighting. It's about a much bigger deal that naturally passes through mankind, and of course through the nation, as far as, again, these are people, your family, and the whole system you are part, but it's heading you towards much higher dimension even. And that, in fact, the aforementioned humanitarian and defeatistic sentiments that, again, you can watch plenty of documentaries about veterans ensnared by these kind of whiners that convince them that for some reason they are the victims of a situation, even when actual wrongdoing is done to them and they're suffering like crazy because of their traumas, of their losses. There is no doubt that this is worth a lot of attention and understanding and care. It's not my impression to give any other message than this. But in that attitude, that attitude constitutes the defeat. All right. Also, death constitutes the defeat to an extent. But tradition says that at least the way you die does matter as far as what you're going to become after. Right. To an extent, you may think that if you die, you simply haven't made it to transfigure. This is not true. All right. At least you will transfigure by a degree. We explained partly the traditional doctrine of afterlife and how that's supposed to work. Essentially, even when, of course, you don't fully attain divinity, because, of course, there is a spark, an element of divinity in all of us, and that's the mean to the overlaps with life, and so it's the mean to reattain it at large. Winning with your second soul, with the so-called second death, which would be the divine judgment, the place in heaven, as opposed to have the soul dying and falling back and dissolving, basically. And so truly dying at that point is the ultimate purpose. It is about entering the ranks of the holy warriors that have managed to prove that, after all, this life, this dimension, this nature can be transcended if you are so noble and high and mighty to face the unavoidable with the proper honor and decorum. This is what actually the entire point of gladiatorial games in Rome was considered, 4 in the wake of the death of famous characters that with their imperium allowed some slaves to accept in the ultimate step their death, knowing that this would elevate them in the afterlife as actual freemen, and evaluated as such in the second, the gate of the second death. This is incredibly important because the Romans founded their own identity literally on this belief. At least the gladiatorial games in particular were, and I made a video about this, of course, they were aiming at essentially reminding the Romans the value of this transfiguration and the obvious attainability of the same. This is, again, of shocking importance when you appreciate how deeply constitutive of, in that case, the greatest power in the history of mankind really was, as far, again, especially the connection with the divine. And so the age of nationalism, naturally we could talk about warfare also in socialism, but as I often said, there is no such thing like socialism without nationalism, right? This is notorious, right? It was never like a fully socialistic or communistic regime. They all employed some kind of nationalistic strategy, all right? This is completely normal. I'm not going to answer this. You can, if you're curious, watch that video about the Soviet abomination of mankind, if you're curious. At the age of nationalism, discovered a suitable replacement for the two great traditional pinnacles: spiritual universality and heroic universality. In what? Imperialism. So imperialism is interesting because it's, again, there is nothing wrong with the empire, right? But in order for an empire to be attained, as you explained, you must achieve this spiritual and heroic universality, right? You have to predispose yourself in practice to attain, like victory, for this attained divinity to transfigure the world. And that's what the purpose of the empire is. The age of nationalisms was acting outside the framework of an empire, or at least empires were defined now on the basis of single national bases, not an overarching national basis that were considered also more or less at the same level, at least in the in history books. And again, the age of nationalism and imperialism is pretty close to us. I mean, here we're talking mostly the age of colonialism, mostly, let's say, up to World War I in particular. Because, again, people criticize, especially the United States, for having been imperialistic. There is something in, again, definitely, there is some imperialism in all of us, right? And in any power, and especially, I don't know, if you look at Russia, or other powers that have a tendentially also, as we'll see now, this anxiety of expansion for a specific sake that is also quite sometimes like, if you don't do that, you collapse because you don't have any other capacity to stand on your legs. This is typical of the fringe. This is typical of inferior cultures that live, in fact, at the outskirts of the bigger empires. In fact, it's a very good comparison. But it's this, you see, empires do seize others' possessions through violence, right? At least that's a byproduct of what eventually imperial expansion turns out to be. Imperialism is instead fundamentally normalizing the fact that this would be some kind of instinctive, natural dynamic that basically can't quite stop, or it's simply how, it's boys being boys, right? This is also, in fact, degenerating the concept of virility itself, because there is no actual broader purpose, right? There is no greater, like if you are, again, as I said before, if you're actually a superior power, you win without need to recur to much violence. If you're able to convince other peoples, right? For example, the United States, that again, the side of the aisle that bitches and complains from the fringe always whines about are the so-called imperialists. But the United States, yes, did a lot of wars, but simply because also they were a gigantic power. And even those wars that are lost, again, depending on the ranking of civilization, so to say, are not simply something that can be seen as the bad war or the good war, right? I started a series on the Vietnam War. We talked just a little bit about Iraq. Now, the problem with those wars, aside from broader things, is not much the fact that, I don't know, the United States went after those countries and, the outcome was what it was, which was also basically winning all battles, right? But losing ultimately and that's a political issue. Like, always remember that victory and defeat have a relative value, right? It's not like a directly proportional thing. We explained this because, again, people think that war is just like, I don't know, scoring football, like in football game, like who won, who lost, 3-2 or something like that. 3-2. This is something much more complex, right? It's mostly about how those wars were waged, because as we explained, divine power, so the power to do that, is always positive, right? You could use it for different things, not just for war, we explained that, but of course from the other side there is another power that is fighting against you, but it's the way you wield it that also matters. And if you're kind of not good at it for different reasons, you will lose, but not because the war per se was bad, all right? So indeed, the way you fight also brings to the outcome of there. Again, the wars, as we explained, always have a cost that at the end of the day you can somehow criticize morally, right? And hopefully from an objective standpoint, right? But indeed, such conduct, like simply seizing whatever you want from other countries for no other reason, has been substituted, and unsurprisingly, especially in post-traditional societies, like in the post-Soviet ones, etc., as a sort of norm, right? It's normal to also, and this is accompanied, of course, by, as we said before, the very low absolute majority of the people. The fact that those peoples are very easy to send to the meat grinder because they're literally worthless in that way. And this imperialistic ideal becoming some kind of sanctification, at least in their subnormal and a traditional world, right? Some of the places most deprived, probably at the narrow cognitive level of any trace of tradition whatsoever, right? It's naturally unsurprising that lesser people root for inferior cultures at the lower echelons of our own superior Western civilization, because of course they would like their own inferiority not to be seen and to merge with lesserness. And of course, as parasites, they never actually leave the nest, but at least they try to self-sabotage it. And in that regard, the concept of imperialism per se, just something for the sake of itself, which also explains the terminological definition of ism, right? For example, a poor or perceivedly spaceless nation is believed to has every right, if not obligation, to seize the resources and territories of others, because otherwise they will fall, right? This is literally the calculation nobody talks about Russia. Russia is collapsing as a culture, even if if they had anything left of that historically. And of course, Ukraine constitutes something that they must seize in order to hope to have any chance compared to other players in the world, including ones that are allegedly friends with, such as China, that is simply going to take over demographically half of Siberia, All right. So in that sense, that's their only justification, or at least alleged justification, for trying this nonsensical move that, again, has a sense, but it's so low that obviously it turns out in the results that you're seeing. That hundreds of thousands of casualties, of course, in a war of attrition, for getting nothing out of it yet. That even if were it to succeed, I made multiple videos about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, would still be, yes, some absolute resources, but not a better system to actually run them, or a better background to have actually, to made this war worth it to begin with. That this was sort of such an asinine decision at the beginning of the war to begin with. I mean, what they did in 2014 was strategically and politically was fine, meaning they seized, yes, this territory, but because they could get Crimea in one shot, and that was functional at least to a development from their side, and the Ukrainians were unprepared and they did bad, right? But in 2022, somebody who invaded, with 1/3 of the force as a country that it's also huge, it has such enormous, presents such enormous difficulties, just even be able to territorial control, which may have not been the broader ideal, but obviously failing in the initial moment with that kind of scarcity of forces revealed all the subnormal cultural inferiority of a country, of a system, of a government that didn't know literally what they were doing. And this is something we stopped talking just about in front of obviously the immense tragedy of the war in Ukraine, and especially the Ukrainian civilian losses, and of course like the broader issue that this brought for the world, but and more obviously from a Western perspective in much deeper ways and higher ones at the same time. But it illustrates obviously enough that we will be talking about this, of how somebody could do such a thing with such complete alienation from it. These are supposed to be, by the way, to understand the vibe of the Ukrainians, because they're allegedly actually Russian, and that there would be support. Where they blipped up everything with the first attack, with no possibility of return, if not this immense bath of blood that is just jamming further the incredibly deteriorated and decadent Russian society, it has 1/5 of Islamic population, appalling social collapse, no trace of ecclesiastical cohesion, exploding families, divorces, atheism, poverty, undereducation, 6% of population living in slavery, chronic alcoholism, and for not talking about all the rest. Then it's obvious that the only outcome is sending hundreds of thousands of these people to be slaughtered, because there's literally no other mean for this country to do anything else, right, other than living in its deep-seated paranoia and radical inferiority complex towards, obviously, what they could never afford to be. And even by remotely having any remote possibility of succeeding in this doomed enterprise. Nevertheless, in some instances, conditions were deliberately engineered to drive a nation toward so-called imperialistic expansion and conquest, or at least like this is something that was, like in this case, mostly designed but just for self-justification. For example, a prime example is the demographic strategy linked to the mantra of strength in numbers. All right, it's not like numbers do not matter. I made multiple videos showing how that is the case. Von Clausewitz, in his Napoleonic, talking about European standards in Napoleonic era, says basically a 3-to-1 in defense, as you know, is in attack. I mean, against a defensive position is what you must kind of have. That there isn't such that there are many things that can happen in different campaigns and battles, but at a bigger scale, numbers do matter, right? I mean, look at the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front against the Axis. But the myth that, again, Goliath is stronger than David, just like in the biblical myth is self-evidently wrong. In fact, there are other factors at play that ultimately lead to specific outcomes. In fact, the war in Ukraine, we explained it fairly in depth that, does not mean, Russia is just 3 times bigger than Ukraine. And it has much less drive than Ukraine to fight the war. And so this is a recipe for disaster from the Russian side, just out of those fundamentals, all right? Another far common and ignoble, driven solely by materialistic motives, is overproduction of some sort, or at least confidence in the fact that some increase in, say, some particular advantage in resources is in and of itself enough to bend, for example, a people fighting. This has been witnessed in so many wars. This, again, it can't be dictated just by the material aspect, which is indeed very much needed in order to fight a war. Here we're talking about the general idea that simply because you are exceedingly expanding, that gives you the political, military, and social alchemy to successfully win a war, right? Industrial power is not everything. It's very good, but it's not everything. War is not about logistics. War is not about some predetermined scheme or whatever. War is about strategy, and politics is the ultimate, orchestrator of the war. So, also the notion again that warfare is basically hands over this technological edge, or again material superiority, etc., is ridiculous, right? It does not have any merit per se. There is something barbaric, paradoxically, about this, because barbarians normally are actually the poor ones, but the actual outcome, right, of just launching waves of stuff against something that is more solid per se, is just either a desperate or very lazy thing to do. All right, and very often these things can go in parallel. Again, just as we've seen for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has a lot of material, but this does not mean, aside from how they have to get it, it's not really going to actually make you win a war. It's not simply a favorable rate in amount of shells showing production that is heading towards, gradually heading. It's not multiple times anymore even an advantage, but having this or that weapon or reserves of missiles or whatever, or drones even, is going to actually make the thing per se. At least there is a force behind that must be able to intelligently and ad hoc use with genius and not just throwing stuff at people. And this, unfortunately, is the product also of this materialistic bias. If you come from places where the only horizon of economics was quinquennial plans, so you didn't even know what a free market was, but it's a bit difficult to have even a founded strategy, because all elements concur, and definitely the economy is important, resources are important, but it's how you use them that actually matters. And so you can come to criticize different aspects of phenomena that have basically assumed global proportions, if anything, in a globalized world, cloaked in sometimes most hypocritical rhetoric. Humanity, right? Do you fight for humanity? What does that actually mean? Humanity in tradition means dirt, all right? Human means dirty. It comes from Latin humus. That's what humanity means. It refers to the fallen kind. It is not mankind. It is not the virility or manhood, depending on the Latin or Germanic etymology, respectively. It's something else. Democracy as well. This is not to criticize specifically the United States or the West that often uses this word, which is not a good thing to use it, because the demos does not actually rule our societies, fortunately enough. Not just we live in an indirect democracy, but it's not the inherent fact of having a universal suffragem, so the possibility to vote, it actually translates a vote into governance. It has nothing to do with that, right? Of course, our systems are still aristocratic. You can't have a society without this hierarchy. We are ruled by the more competent people, which may seem strange, but literally the rest of the people are as bad as it gets. And if they are better, why aren't they taking their backside of the chair and get somewhere with that, right? That's also what it's taken to rule and to govern. Also, the notion of freedom, I would say the freedom of peoples at least, is pernicious. First of all, if we assume that there are different peoples, what kind of, is there a different freedom or freedom for everyone? What does freedom mean? That they can do whatever they want? Isn't ruling the world, isn't fighting a war to begin with to actually, as von Clausewitz says, compelling the enemy to fulfill your will to a degree? It is a good thing. It is a good thing. In tradition, only God has freedom. And it's definitely a noble undertaking to try to attain freedom in a broader sense, so we can appreciate the attempt. But it's rather liberty that, by human conventional standards, you want to achieve. You want to broker a deal, essentially. And you want to do so not by achieving... Again, humanity, as long as you're a mortal person, you cannot be free by definition. All right? Only God can. You can't. You can't be a liber. So a guy who has some degree of autonomy under superior people's rule, I mean, when you are the superior person, you still have your own limits, and so you can't be free. Because without God's love, you can't fully be free. And without that, automatically means you're not that. All right? Or at least you can try to follow it, but not to attain it, because you're still faulty because of your original sin that perdures because of your active sin, not because somebody impressed it to you back in the day. Also, the concept of holy war has been smeared, right? You think about, Islamic fundamentalism. There isn't anything actually traditional about that. If you, aside from broader theological implications about Islam, it's not like the jihad did not come straightforwardly out of, the Iranian tradition of holy war back when the Arabs were heavily informed by Persian warfare in the Indo-European concept of holy war. It's properly the mean by which it is to be attained, and the standards of the people who claim that they can attain it that defies this, all right? You can argue that any nobility entails a holiness, all right? So, again, there is some level of gallantry, the military is fascinating because there is still a lot of chivalry ethos in the military. There is a lot of values of deeper meanings of commitment, of discipline. These are all things that definitely improve people to a degree. But if there is not an ultimate aim, if your country as a whole does not have a government that uses the military in an effective way, it's not that by being the military you would go anywhere, right? Otherwise, you would be just a case of warriors that basically make their own junta and coup and rule a country in militaristic ways. That's not what it means to be a citizen in arms, according to along with tradition. And so this is something. I mean, being the policeman of the world is actually one of the few things that makes sense. Except, of course, you have always to measure you have to be up to it, first of all, and you also have to realize that unless you control the world, literally, there is something you have to fix. And of course, there is a continuous antagonism, there's a continuous competition. It's normal. But remember that up to a couple of 100 years ago, at least in our part of Europe, we lived under a Holy Roman Empire, right? And that's something which we have to sort of make sense of. It can't be forgotten that the standard of at least the unattainable universal empire was to be above everyone by just ordering each one's role in a broader hierarchy would make the ranking correct, right? And so without creating any problem in this. And this is exactly how the world is. There are some countries that are more important, some countries are less important. And they work according to their ratios of power alongside this very fluid sort of balancing system, right, to stimulate different reactions, not, etc. There are even the new crusades, right? Famously enough, also made videos about this. The crusade in Europe was, as you know, part of the speech probably of Eisenhower before the day, and there was also the title given by him to the 1943-5 U.S. invasion in his book, which is not a bad thing, also considering that Eisenhower was the greatest commander of the 20th century, and that, if anything, represents a great part of that nobility that would fit well with a crusade. But if you look at, for example, another contemporary, General MacArthur, this was so far to call himself a knight of the Grail in the war of, this is all literal, of American capitalist civilization against the divine right Japanese empire. Now, MacArthur is an incredibly fascinating figure for many reasons, and again, his idea of nuking China, for that matter, as much as, Patton was thinking about, was favorable about nuking Moscow, St. Petersburg, was, or at least Leningrad, as it was called at the time, really mirror the kind of, right set of mind that would be fitting in such circumstances. It's just perplexing how these people could, at least in this case, from MacArthur's quote, you realize that there is a disconnect between the idea of a capitalist civilization versus a divine right, a divine right empire. And so it sounds bad enough, but it's also proof that not everything that is said, in fact, reflects the truth, unfortunately. The Americans crushed Japan, all right? So that is what traditionally matters. And it matters because aside from the post-World War II rhetoric that served, obviously, for the West to maintain an important control over the former defeated. And again, so the Japanese became the honorable samurais who fought and died so nobly for their fight. There were a bunch of charlatans, dysfunctionally fascistic, underdeveloped country that literally was disoriented in the broader. I recently made a video about the Battle of Midway. We highlighted some aspects of this. The Knight of the Holy Grail, being MacArthur himself in this clash, would, however, highlight what in here? That power is power. That if I want to crush you, that there's a will to power in this statement that shows you that even if you have at least a claim against of having divine right, this is not what we Americans, as capitalist civilization, will tolerate if you are this lame as you are. And so it's more like a mockery. It's more like the myth. It's surely there's a lot of positivistic myth, the American myth. There is a lot of, think how Fordism influenced. We talk about how the U.S. somehow, what they have been witnessing, at least in the last generations, in terms of decline, etc. It's something that, at least the last generation, something that is seated in, obviously, the sort of the bad sides that every culture has. Right, and so here you look at this MacArthurian statement as a provocation that highlights America as that symbol of capitalist civilization, so high to crush anything else, and who cares about what you claim about divine right, divine rule. This is not exactly the best way to go, at least if the actual outcome is not just destroying an enemy, and that's fine. But it is the fact that you're basically signaling people. And so you as a leader, as a commander, somebody who has to inspire that fidelity, that devotion, that commitment, that actually capitalism, that as we've seen, is actually an enemy term, is more important than divinity, than the sacred. And what does that mean? I mean, would an American wonder what that is? Of course, at the time, Americans were very religious at large. So they would look at MacArthur, that was notoriously quite a character, and say, okay, this guy is crazy, but he does what he does, and he succeeds in as much as this was considered as an act of pure sort of provocation, was fine. But unfortunately, already in that time, American society was starting to turn toward that more like capitalistic, self-imposed sort of capitalistic degeneration of a healthy management of capital, and mistaking that for, or exchanging that for divinity, gradually, if you want. But still, and this is a problem we had all across the world. I mean, communists definitely believe in capitalism in the sense that they identify it as an enemy. And so they're, as materialists, that's where the problem starts from. And so those are that bad. In the West, we actually are the ones who maintain the concept of holy power, and show that, again, by that level of power itself. And in this sense, and there are also different ways. I mean, different rhetorics, the action against the aggressor, who's the aggressor, why are wars fought. Wars are fought in many ways. It's not just being the defender that changes necessarily, again, why that war was broke out. It's just like the point we made for Ukraine. Ukraine, unfortunately, was within the Soviet Union for a long time. Great part of that were taken over by the Tsars back in the day. In a sense, Ukrainians were responsible for this at a point. They called themselves the Muscovine at a point, and others instead stayed out of that. Some remained in the Habsburgic Empire, but in that sense, again, they had lost ground to these other powers. And so it's not absolutely that you can't be happy for what is happening at all, right? And we've seen that here we are pro-Ukraine. But I mean, the explanation of why this war exists lays not in a conventional, I told you, because they were Russian, now they have to go back under Russia. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the sad fact that at some point, collectively as a world, we let, for example, a power like the Tsarist or the Soviet or the Russian one in general spread unchecked, right? Look at what happened after World War I, right? I also made a video about, about Peltura. We've seen the Polish Bolshevik War. I mean, the Westerners were bailed out. They bailed out even of the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Like, at least during the latter, there could be an intervention, but we were exhausted and said, we can't intervene there. And Europe turned out to be a mess, also because of the consolidation of the Soviet Union that triggered further Nazi fascist reaction to that, and so escalated further towards another direction. This is often misunderstood, forgotten, mistold, but we have to always realize that, just like the Poles, how they were partitioned at some point. Why did get Poland partitioned? Because they were a functional system. They were so advanced. In the case of Ukraine, for example, today we see how much redemption can make. What a splendid result, what a beautiful result, what an incredible result can there be where you really stand up to your oppressor, because you have finally found the awareness, the faith, right, of acknowledging your worth and your potential. This is extraordinary, also and especially in historical terms, because again, you pass from being subject to be something else, right, to dictate rule. And to your former master. This is something which can't be forgotten. This is really inspiring. This is really what heroism is about. And there are just a few examples in history, right? It happens frequently, but the happy ending is rare as it gets, because everything is often more shaded usually, but sometimes things really go in ways that really are amazing and incredible. Besides the hypocrisy behind any power can be always pointed out. Again, it depends on the measure, who they are, why it happens, etc. It's very easy to make stupid propaganda. Another thing is to make actually good propaganda, because good propaganda tells the truth, right? And propaganda has nothing to do with whether something is false or true. Propaganda can be true. It just means, like in the Latin etymology says, it has to be propagated, which is another point. And people don't even know that. That's what those are the ones who believe any propaganda. Well, this the false one. And so we've seen that there are all kind of greedy interests that are, however, a motive. And how can you deny that it is one, right? You can't do stuff with stuff, right? So that's an obvious motivation. It's not like again, there are many jarring examples of socialistic, communistic ideas of universal, say, brotherhood that immediately were destroyed during the war, even within, socialistic parties, within national realities. They said, okay, but our nation still is the place where our socialism can thrive, and so let's fight for it, because then later we will. This is also, for example, what socialists did in Germany during World War I, right? Regardless of eventually the sabotage that happened across all the system because of socialism, the lesser of our system that obviously are the ones more crushed, more sent to the meat grinder, because they are the easiest to send, and that do not they understand less what is happening, and therefore sabotage through these destructive ideologies. And we could open endless parentheses regarding the guilt of this and that movement. The important is to realize that they very often overlap, more often than not. Meanwhile, our scientific means have pushed warfare to extreme mechanization and technicalization, such as that it's no longer man against man, but machines against man, employing a type of especially aerial warfare that is very indiscriminate, does not really look at who you are. If you think about nuclear weapons, you can realize how much we have lost control, not of our means of destruction, but of as individual people, right? As individual warriors, so to say, back in the day, how much we sort of subcontract our own security to other people because we assume that our civilization works, which mostly does, right? And nuclear weapons prevented a hell of a lot of wars for that matter, and changed the world for a better purpose, but still are a double-edged sword, and so something you can't quite fully control. Chemical weapons, it depends on again, is it worse to be killed by a rifle, or gassed, or killed by an atomic bomb, or by a phosphorus grenade? Like how do you think it happens, right? Because it's not really that. For example, most of these bans on certain weapons is ridiculous objectively, because it's not like, again, you're going to die less painfully killed by a drone than you are by, cluster bomb, right? That's not even the point. That's, of course, in this case, the latter weapons is mostly forbidden because of the consequences after the dispersion of dangerous explosives, also after the war, and it's similar danger for civilians. But say in general, right? These calculated systems of mass annihilation are devoid of light or hope, meaning they are preemptively effective and absolutely needed, but it's something that sort of we are not ready to handle. We were never ready to handle, as the Promethean myth states, but in the sense that as far as tradition is forgotten, there is a much higher risk that they're going to be used for the wrong purpose. And again, we have destructivity previously imaginable only for eradicating microbes or insects. And so the problem is not much the fact that we have these weapons, but that the civilization that we have is much less controlled. It has much less braking systems than it could have, of course, in the past. Again, it's not like in the past. We were talking about it just the other day about medieval strategy. That there's someone who talked about the English chevauchée in Normandy as a kind of Hiroshima at the time, because they were really that destructive. So it's not like this hasn't quite changed. But the system was much more directly straightforward. Responsibility was much more directly identifiable. If anything, actions were more controlled and specifically wanted. Today, we are weak. These things exist. There are big risks. If you look at civilizational decay, which is obviously going to happen at some point with our type of power disgregating together civilization, all these forces can be launched in really unwanted directions with enormous risk, right? And so we are also witnessing this at the other levels that we've seen, namely millions of men forcibly torn from occupations and callings entirely unrelated to a holy life, reduced, as military jargon terms it, to human material, perishing in such events. This is really the type of reflection, let's say, of the lack of actual progress that must unavoidably just point at, again, materialism or relativism to see the lack of any higher and unitary will in mankind as a matter of normality, right? This is not definitely what we want. This is really not essentially what we are we were supposed to achieve. Naturally, again, there are many different topics that we can discuss related to it. I'm not making the case that we are exhaustively dealing with such topics, but they are a first step, and I think that we can go that direction without too much of a problem. And I think that this was a useful introduction to show, because I never really made a video of this kind. And again, it's not really different or out of line compared to my typical one. But it is at least showing you that how much I give for granted that these things are known to just pass to what matters more, all right? Because every idiot is capable of criticizing the system, but not having the palest idea of that he's actually the one contributing to make it worse. It's always the same. So I avoided to also in this video to make any case for some, people who are in charge of the system are actually worse than whom, like those who don't know how to run it. It doesn't make much sense. Like, power is intertwined in so many different levels. Politicians are not absolute power men that decide everything by themselves. Our systems are very sort of egalitarianly distributed, even among the aristocracy, so that there is not really a single product. That's why we don't live in totalitarian regimes and barking at leaders because say, okay, they're weak because they're not this great individual leaders. Yeah, exactly, because they really suck. They would suck otherwise at being so, and that's why we have a much more comprehensive system that helps us managing it. And those who try to be the monocratic rulers tendentially seem to be quite even worse and incompetent, as we just described in many ways. And so again, I don't think that there is such great, let's say, advantage or happiness regarding such positions, and that's exactly not what I'm going to talk about myself. Probably will not see too much other videos of this kind because, again, that's not really my narrative. I don't push for this particular approach, but it's there. It's a facet of it that must be acknowledged, that the system in which we live currently, given that it's not informed by tradition, is dysfunctional, right? And so the problem is not this or that faction or group, or at least they are, but they are still in different ways as a whole, because they are what they are, because we live in a world informed without much tradition. But tradition still exists and must be recognized in a fluid way, not in sort of fixed, predetermined slogans or, set of rhetorical winery. No. All right, there is always a reality surprising you as far as the complexity of the same. So, again, we must be particularly careful and remaining very much in control of our understanding and our objectivity, because without that, really, we don't go anywhere, and it doesn't make any sense to go in that direction. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.